You're watching Fugitive Red-Eye, and welcome to the Season 2 premiere of my OverAnalyzing series. Today is the first part of a six-parter on the Red Dwarf novels. Now, I mentioned it is a six-parter, however, I am going to space it out throughout the season so that you don't get, bombarded with nothing but the same thing. I'm thinking every other episode until I complete the six-parter will be part of it, and I'm going to try to do the episodes weekly, but no promises on that. So as this is the first part of the six-parter, I'm going to go ahead and get to the basic outline of what the Red Dwarf novels are. Then I will follow up with 4 individual parts covering each of the novels in depth on their own. And finally, I will end it off with a conclusion of my overall thoughts of the novel series. So since this part is just really the introduction, let's get right into it. So as far as that goes, Red Dwarf is a very long-running British comedy series. So it should be no surprise that it has spawned other forms of media. And amongst that, there is 4 novels. There's other books as well, including a role-playing game, some behind-the-scenes stuff, and a few other things. But we're going to focus on the novels for this little mini-series. So the 4 novels are as follows. The first novel, which is called Red Dwarf Infinity Welcomes Careful Drivers, also sometimes simply referred to as Red Dwarf, but for the sake of these videos I will refer to it as Infinity Welcomes Careful Drivers, because that way it's easy to differentiate. The second book is Red Dwarf Better Than Life, which is a direct sequel to Infinity Welcomes Careful Drivers. Both of those were written by Rob Grant and Doug Naylor together. It was a co-authored job. The third book was called Last Human, and it was written by Doug Naylor on his own. This was after the two had kind of split off a little bit, so I'm imagining that this book was written around the time of Series 7. The first 2 books having been written between, I believe, Series 2 and 3, possibly slightly later or possibly slightly earlier, but sometime around that general area. Rob Grant went on to write his own sequel, Backwards. So Backwards and Last Human are each alternative sequels to Better Than Life. They go down completely different routes and branch out in their own ways, and it's very interesting to see how the 2 authors handle it differently. As far as the books themselves, they contain many different original plot points. For instance, you see how Lister met Rimmer. You see how Lister got aboard Red Dwarf in the first place. You get some detailed stuff about how holograms work, and it describes how the Nova 5 crashed. There's also several things that were either later used in episodes or were readaptations of content from episodes. There's a little bit of both. For instance, White Hole was actually adapted from something involving a black hole in Better Than Life, whereas the Better Than Life concept itself was taken from the show and put into the novel. Both Backwards and Last Human heavily featured all sorts of stuff from different episodes. Both of them do have things from Gunman of the Apocalypse, with Backwards having a lot more to do with Gunman of the Apocalypse than Last Human does. But on top of that, Last Human gives the series a definitive ending. And one could argue Backwards does as well. The way the 2 handle it is different, as I'll get into when I get to those individual videos. The books themselves follow a completely separate continuity that actually don't follow the show. However, the book's continuity is more consistent, and some of it has been later canonized into the show to an extent. Again, with Red Dwarf, it's hard to say because of all the retcons, inconsistencies, and plot holes, but the books themselves are definitely their own thing. For instance, in the first book, Captain Hollister does not exist. Instead, it's a character named Captain Kirk, who is a female captain. On top of that, even though Todd Hunter's name is mentioned in the first book, a lot of his role is played by a character by the name of Petrovich. The books themselves are loaded with lots of great humor, and it feels like you're watching an episode of the show despite some of the differences. I myself would recommend reading the actual books themselves. I personally own the omnibus, which contains the first 2 books, and then I own books 3 and 4 individually. I also do have a copy of Better Than Life, even though it is contained in the omnibus, because I didn't realize it was at the time. If you don't want to actually read it with your eyes, you don't want to actually have to read it, you can listen to the audiobooks. Now, in preparation for this video, I have listened to the audiobooks of the first 3 books. I have not fully listened to the audiobook of Backwards, but I've listened to a little bit of it. So as far as that goes, with the audiobooks for the first 2, there's actually 2 versions of the audiobooks. There's the shortened radio show versions and the unabridged versions. I listened to the radio show versions leading up to this, because those were on Amazon Music. As far as Last Human and Backwards go, I believe there's only the unabridged version, however there is still content missing from Backwards. The first 2 books are narrated by Chris Berry, both in the abridged version and in the unabridged version. The third book, Last Human, is read by Craig Charles, and finally, Backwards is read by Rob Grant. So that gives you an idea of how these books are so far. Like I said, I'll be going more in-depth with each one as I progress with this little 6-part mini-series, but that does it to give you a taste of this. This has been Fugitive Red-Eye with OverAnalyzing. Like I said, this is part 1 of a multi-parter, so we'll see how it goes from here. Have a great rest of the day.